My name is Abby Robinson. I'm Program Management Advisor here at the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, or DCAF. And it is my pleasure to be able to welcome everyone to this afternoon's panel discussion on exploring the implications of the use of private military and security companies on Libyan oil fields. We have an excellent set of speakers lined up for this afternoon for what we are certain will be an interesting and engaging discussion. And I want to start with a special thanks to our donors and in particular the members of the Trust Fund for North Africa who have made this possible. And before we begin, I'd also just like to offer a couple of administrative notes. First, we do have simultaneous interpretation available in Arabic. Please do not be confused by the fact that the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen says Korean. This is actually Arabic. Feel free to take advantage of this feature. And we will also have, of course, a question and answer period after our panel members are finished speaking. And we would encourage you to submit your questions. Please do so only using the Q&A feature rather than the chat. And our co-hosts for today's discussion, Roberta, Samuel, and Ehab, will thank you for that, as they will be helping us respond to as many of these questions as possible. Before we begin our panel discussion, I would like to introduce Mr. Ayman Ayoub, who is the head of our Middle East and North Africa division here at DCAF. Prior to coming to DCAF, Ayman served as regional director for West Asia and North Africa at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. He has more than 26 years of experience in development assistance, democracy building, and rule of law support. He's served as a senior expert for the UN, the EU, and a number of other international organizations. And since early 2011, he's also assisted and acted as an advisor for a number of the transitional and reform processes which have been undertaken across the Middle East. Ayman is unfortunately unable to stay with us for the entire time today, so we are particularly happy that he's able to offer opening remarks for today's session. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Ayman.
Thank you very much, Abby, for those words. And again, upfront, goes my apology certainly for not being able to sit in the entire discussion. But I'm very much looking forward really to learning about it, through my colleagues. But I guess all of us would understand that the last weeks of the year are especially coming with charged agendas for all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, I won't be long. I would just like to first of all thank this opportunity, and on behalf of DCAF, and especially on behalf of the MENA team and of the Business and Security Division teams, extend a warm welcome to all of you, to all participants, and especially to our distinguished guests and panelists. It is obvious to us, that the question of oil revenue distribution has been, continues to be an important driver for conflict in Libya. The current developments and the ongoing, I can say, tensions between Libya's central bank and the National Oil Corporation over the modalities of oil revenue distribution illustrate how timely this discussion is, certainly. The very recent news even coming in today and from this very morning, and yet to be confirmed, about a possible deal that may have been struck between the central bank and the National Oil Corporation, further confirm how actual and timely is this discussion indeed. Such a deal may, and hopefully it may indeed lead to unfreezing revenues and eventually to achieving other objectives, such as, for example, aspiring at having a unified national budget for the East and West. Given the vital importance of oil revenues, oil extraction was oftentimes weaponized by various forces. Oil infrastructure has therefore needed, I would say, at all times, special protection. This usually requires collaboration with and by local communities, which was achieved by hiring local youth into protection forces. These forces, notably the Petroleum Facilities Guard, have in specific times not escaped the avatars of the Libyan conflict, and therefore have been aligned with different and competing political agendas within the Libyan conflict. More recently, some foreign private companies, private security companies, also took positions on terminals by passing local protection schemes and raising concerns that permanent presence of such private military and security companies would lead to increased pressure on Libyan authorities to probably accept or be more influenced by foreign political agendas, and therefore further complicating the complex. Oil production and exports have resumed, and for the most part, foreign private companies, military and security companies, I must say, have withdrawn from the installations, but they have done so only to be stationed, in most cases, in their vicinity. Recent developments of the Joint Military Commission, the known 5+5, have led to an agreement towards the unification of the petroleum facilities gas. But details are yet to be decided, and thus it remains to be seen how applicable, how sustainable such an agreement may be. We are therefore happy to be able to organize today's discussion against the backdrop of a recent signed ceasefire agreement. The implications of the use of private military security companies on Libyan oil fields, which is a topic too often overlooked, poses important questions for security sector reform and governance in the aftermath of such a ceasefire agreement in Libya. This event, I must say, also comes after a series of webinars aimed at rethinking traditional approaches to ICSR, security sector reform, organized by DCAF, always anchored in the specificities or in a good understanding of the specificities of the Libyan context. DCAF's increasing engagement on hybrid security is an important component of our strategy, as it allows us to, as an organization, to be totally in line with reality on the ground and to ensure support towards efficient and inclusive long-term security sector reform and governance that actually does not leave anyone behind, nor it neglects any of the relevant sectors and actors. I would therefore like to end here by thanking you again for joining us for today's event, and to especially thank our moderator and panelists for their contribution. I very much look forward to learning more through your contributions in order to ensure that we can continue to offer well-informed and well-founded support initiatives and programs from DCAF that aim at meeting the real needs and aspirations of the Libyan people at large. Thank you very much, and I hope we all benefit from this discussion. Back to you.
Many thanks, Ivan, for those remarks, and really for reminding us of both the timeliness and the complexity of today's discussion, and the importance, really, I think, of engaging with the complexity of this particular context. Something I know all of our panelists are going to talk about in their own way. So next, I would like to introduce the first member of the panel, Mr. Tim Eaton, who is a senior research fellow with Chatham House's Middle East and North Africa program. His research focuses on the political economy of the Libyan conflict. In 2018, he authored a report on the development of Libya's war economy, which illustrates how economic activities have become increasingly connected to violence. Previously, he managed Chatham House's research on the Syrian conflict. And prior to joining Chatham House, he worked for BBC Media Action in projects in Iraq, Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya. Tim, we're very pleased to have you with us today. And we actually have a couple of questions before you get started, and we hope you can respond to these in your remarks. Given your background and your expertise, you'd be very interested in your thoughts on how the current feud between the Central Bank of Libya and the National Oil Corporation might factor into questions around protection of oil infrastructure. And we're also eager to hear, how you can give us some context to the deployment of private military and security companies in Libya's extractive sector. So what do you think are the implications of these deployments on Libya's war economy? Do you expect that this dynamic might exacerbate pre-existing patterns of rent seeking in the economy, or perhaps create new patterns? So over to you, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Abigail, and thank you to DCAF for this kind invitation to be with you this afternoon. It is an incredibly timely event, and I think that Ayman's opening remarks are really on point, the contextualizing of the oil sector in the broader conflict dynamics of Libya. And I think perhaps starting off by zooming out a little bit, it's important to ask how the oil sector affects the conflict, but also how it's impacted by the conflict itself. And certainly, I wouldn't pretend that competition over resources is the only aspect of Libya's conflict. It's certainly not all about the money. But at the same time, if you don't understand the issues over this competition of resources and how they connect to violence, and how warring constituencies and actors mobilize and are able to sustain their networks through economic power, then I think you're missing a real key feature of the conflict. And at the same time, I think there's a common misconception that talk about the economy can somehow be a bit more technocratic or apolitical. But of course, as we're witnessing with this feud between the CBL and the NOC, decisions in this sector have a major impact, major political impact. And I think it's worth just looking back at the history of how we kind of got here with the CBL and the NOC to kind of draw out some of those trends. And you can see from looking at it that it's the result of quite a long-term falling out. That's also gotten personal between the heads of the institutions and been exacerbated by ongoing governance challenges across the country. And particularly as a result of the oil sector being used for political leverage. And of course, as we know, varying groups, individuals have used the oil sector and sought to weaponize it in some sense to generate political leverage. This can be for a number of reasons. It can be regarding historical grievances over the distribution of Libyan resources at a national level, a heartfelt sense that the regions that are oil producing aren't generating or getting the benefit of the resources that they should be, that a political system is overly centralized in Tripoli and they see vast amounts of money washing around there which don't seem to be reaching their communities. At other points, it can be for quite nakedly political reasons. We've seen blockades be used to further political leverage ahead of major international talks. We should note, of course, that the blockade in 2020 was put in place only 2 days before the Berlin conference. And whilst it was pitched as a blockade which was about local concerns of tribal interests, that really rang quite hollow in many quarters because it appeared that the Libyan Arab Armed Forces of Haftar were really the ones with the ability to allow that blockade to continue or to bring it to a close. Of course, we've also seen the oil sector be used in other blockades, notably by Ibrahim Jadran and others, federalists, to actually seek major political change within the country. So this is something that's been going on. And I think for any of you that have engaged or followed Mustafa Sanallah over this period, I think you'll have witnessed a slow and increasing frustration with the situation whereby a national oil corporation that is focused on doing its work, getting the oil out of the ground and getting the money in the bank, how that work has been sidelined by these battles. And there have been many attempts by the NOC to kind of stop these types of developments occurring, to shut down, to prevent the shutdowns, to keep the oil sector above the conflict. But the truth is that it's the lifeblood of the Libyan economy. And for many of the groups and communities that are in control of these areas, it's their key source of political leverage. So that hasn't been a realistic goal or one that's proved possible. And I think for this reason, you've seen a differing approach by NOC in this period, in 2020, where it's been much more forthright in its willingness to engage in political negotiations and put forth ideas about how to bring an end to the oil blockade and actually seek a resulting political settlement. So at the moment, we see an NOC that's very much at the heart of a political conversation about the governance and the economic governance of the state and how that might be reformed. And that, of course, has brought it into direct conflict with the central bank. There are long-standing grievances with the central bank over what funding it has allocated to the NOC, with NOC contending that that's been inadequate. And at the same time, if you look at the statements that have come out, those statements coming out of the NOC have also given credence to long-standing complaints about the actions of the central bank, how it's operated, and also questions about how the money is actually distributed. So really, this moment is a critical one. I think it's kind of a sea change, and it's a very dangerous moment in many senses because it puts the whole functioning, or what remains of the functioning, of the Libyan economy up for grabs. Now that focuses minds. We've seen in the coming out of the meeting from yesterday that actually there seems to be some tentative, probably quite terse agreement to look at some of these issues and formulate a committee headed by elements of the GNA and the various elements of the central bank to try and address some of these problems. But it really shows that actually they're currently being competed, and what the risk for this is that of miscalculation. And of course, the problem is that increasingly it also seems to use the oil sector as leverage again. In that sense, it's actually not that different from a blockade, theoretically, because it's withholding from a recognized government. And this was done by the NOC, not with the government itself. And so I think that's an important broader context. Pivoting to the actual physical control of oil and gas infrastructure, this has also been impacted by the same dynamics that I've just mentioned. The Petroleum Facilities Guard, PFG, have some elements played key roles in the revolution. Other armed groups from the revolutionary through were integrated into an expanded Petroleum Facilities Guard that aren't really under the control of the National Oil Corporation. So if you look at a support unit such as the kind of infamous Nasser Brigade in Zawiya, that seems to be part of a PFG structure, but it's by no means under the control of NOC and has been heavily implicated in certain types of smuggling. And when the NOC actually sought to force the removal of the Nasser Brigade, the mysterious circumstances that surrounded it ended up in something like a 900-kilometer electricity blackout, and the Nasser Brigade were back within a few days. So the nature of control of these, the oil and gas infrastructure, and the inability of the NOC to really have a tight hold on that has led to a strong push from NOC to reform the PFG or to bring in private contractors to help bridge and solve some of these problems. But I would argue that they're still beset by the same structural challenges, in that you can't isolate this situation out. If you are from a small town in Rayena and you do feel like you're not getting your what you deserve from the central government, then the oil pipeline remains your key point of leverage. And so I've been struck in conversations with Mustafa Sanallah every year at the Chatham House oil conference, where I'd ask him about these problems. And he would often begin to answer his question. Well, he answered once where he said, the NOC isn't the government, but. And then many of the things he went on to describe were very much things to do with government, or what should be to do with government in terms of services, community relations. And so I think this issue around control of the oil and gas infrastructure is a very difficult one to square. and therefore theoretical discussions about reform or chains of command will be very difficult to actually make stick unless they really do connect to these broader elements of the conflict. And I think maybe that's a moment where we are now. So hopefully that gives a bit of a rambling context to this discussion and where it fits and perhaps the limits to what it can achieve.
Thank you very much. And I think you've helpfully outlined, in terms of the context, really what's at stake here, just how much is at stake at this particular moment, and what it means for different communities. And you've also picked up, of course, on the nature of hybridity, I think, in some of these structures, which I think will come up in other speakers' remarks as well, just in terms of understanding maybe the fluidity in terms of what is government and what is not government, and ultimately, with a view toward understanding what communities need in terms of security and why this is so important. So thank you. With that, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Jean-Michel Rousseau, who is the Deputy Head of the Business and Security Division at DCAF. He leads the division's work on private military and security companies. This includes serving as strategic lead on DCAF's work as Secretariat of the Montreux Document Forum and its support to the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Providers. He also works on strengthening national level private security regulation across the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America and the Caribbean. And Jean-Michel, I think this is a great opportunity for us to hear a little bit from you on the broader question of really what are the existing norms and good practices which surround the regulation of private military and security services, and how could they be of use in this particular context? We're also interested in hearing about the notion of due diligence of the oil sector and how that might come into play when it comes to procurement of security services specifically. And finally, we'd like to hear a little bit about what you think some practical approaches and tools might be for states, civil society, and for the private sector in terms of regulation, oversight, and procurement of private military and security services. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Abigail, and thank you to all of you. And first of all, I think on behalf also of as Business and Security Division, welcome to this webinar, and that we have the privilege of co-organizing jointly with our colleagues in the House from the MENA division, and for me personally as well. It's before I was in this position, I actually used to head the North Africa team at DCAF, so it's that included Libya. So it's haven't been in a Libya discussion for a couple of years, but it's it's a great privilege before the end of the year to still be able to be part of such a distinguished panel. Maybe I think two points initially in response to your questions. I think a key thing to underline is that private military and security companies do not operate in a legal vacuum. I mean, I think we've seen this perception in a number of settings, a number of conflicts where there have been participation by such companies, and I think it's critical to underline that there is no legal vacuum, and that there are ways to strengthen the regulation of their companies even in complex and fragile environments. And the tools, and that's my second point, the norms and good practices that are out there were actually designed for these kinds of situations. I'll talk about the Montreux document particularly like in my next part, but this is a process that was born out of experience, notably in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s, which are not Libya, but where there was also some degree of complexity, fragility, conflict, post-conflict, and so I think the point I'm making is that these norms actually, I think there's it's not norms that come out of experience that are not applicable to the Libyan context, that would be completely alien to it, and I think that's an important element and a positive element. Right now, I mean the key international norm out in terms of states' obligations to regulate is the Montreux document, the Montreux document, I already talked about it, the process it was born out, but the Montreux document basically reiterates the obligations that states have under international law to regulate private military and security company. So there's two components to this. The Montreux document is based on IHL, so the law of armed conflict. So under the Geneva Conventions, which you could argue that at least to some extent they apply in Libya, states are obligated to regulate PMSCs, and it's not a faculty; it's actually an obligation that states would have to regulate them. And then the document can also apply to other situations if states decide so. But I think Libya is a good case where you could make a reasonable assumption that the armed conflict component at least is valid to some extent, and would mean that there's an obligation under the Geneva Conventions. And I think an interesting part about the document is that it doesn't just apply to the territorial state, so the state where the company's operating, but it also applies to the home state, so the state where the companies are from, and the contracting states, so the states that might be contracting such companies. And I think that's something that that this mix of the three states, I think is a reflection on the situations that we encountered in previous years in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think which to some extent are still valid for Libya. And so I think the fact that maybe national institutions might not be best placed to fully regulate, doesn't mean that there are no entry points, because other states actually could have a role and actually would have an obligation to do so as well. So I think just to underline that. There are also other initiatives at play. You mentioned the code of conduct that we support as well, which is more focused on companies themselves, private security companies that deliver service in complex environments. And from what I see, there's a number of them that are operating in Libya, so that would also be applying to them. But that's more this for the internal processes. And then we also have the the voluntary principles in security and human rights that are also focused on to guide extractive companies to conduct human rights compliant security operations. So that would then look at the specific companies. So just to say, I'll go into the practical aspect in a second, but there are a number of norms and good practice out there that I think could actually be relevant to the Libyan context. Not necessarily, there's obviously they're obviously backed by, there's initiatives behind them, there's processes and et cetera. But so I think it might take some time for Libya as as a country to support these formally, but definitely the norms and good practices contained in these initiatives can already be relevant for the context right now. And then looking, as you're looking at your, I think question of the due diligence. I mean, I've touched already on the voluntary principles, but under the discussion that's we're seeing right now from our side at the international level, there is an obligation. I mean, if you look at the UN guiding principles, I mean, companies are supposed to respect human rights, and that means an adequate due diligence processes for the operations in terms of security, particularly, and so that would also give some indications about what companies could be doing in the Libyan context. For the part about practical ways to go forward, I don't want to also take too much of the time. I think one key thing is obviously I was already hinting at that in my at the beginning, is strengths in regulation. That can include the way that I think there we feed into the more general reform discussions underway in Libya. How can the regulation of private military security companies operating there be strengthened from the central level? But I think Tim made a very good point as well. On the local level, it's not just about having a regulation and oversight, coming from Tripoli, but also the communities around are there's a leverage, but they're also impacted by the work of the security actors that are guarding the facilities. And so it would be important to also have this multi-level approach to strengthen governance and regulation. At the same time, I think just to stress that again, the Montreux document talks about two other categories of states. So the states, in case it's not a Libyan company, the company would be have a headquarters somewhere else. And those home states also have an obligation to adequately regulate the companies, which has an impact on the situation on the ground. And in case these companies are hired by other states, then these states would also have an obligation to to adequately regulate. So this is, I think, in terms of the regulation. Now, in terms of the procurement, and I think there, I'm making the link with particularly with what Tim was saying, on the, if the NOC is the client of the companies, or other entities are the clients of the companies, and let's assume not the state or a public institution, so to speak, hired them, but the public corporation or private, fully private company, then procurement is also an important way to to make sure that the companies are operating at a high standard. The company has had the leverage. We understand that obviously there's a number of factors at play. So the company wouldn't have a fully independent hand maybe, but the company has a leverage, an economic leverage, but through the decision, for example, which in-house security is deployed on the sites. And to look at the impact, then to manage and mitigate the security provided by these, let's say PMSCs as part of in-house security. So I think that part is very important, because regulation is key, but contracting procurement is also a leverage that, particularly in these fragile situations, is often overlooked. And maybe just to add a point on this, now we're talking about the I think the NOC is a good example, because a lot of times when we talk about procurement, it's assumed that it's private entities that would contract PMSCs, but a lot of times it's actually states or public entities that contract them. And so I think the NOC is a good case in point. And then finalizing, I think practically there, I was talking about the local level in terms of regulation, but I think there's also obviously a role there of oversight. I think the way we come at it from DCAF, particularly from our division, is to make sure that that PMSCs are operating in ways that to avoid security and human rights risks by having adequate regulation oversight. And I think there, in a situation like the Libyan one, obviously the role of local communities is essential, because the communities are the ones that are in direct interaction with the companies, and would probably be the ones that would have among the highest numbers of risks if these companies were indeed to act in adequate ways. So I think the oversight aspect. So summing up, there are no international norms and good practice in place, notably the Montreux document that really provides good practice to states on how to regulate, and not just the state, in that case Libya, but also other states that have a relationship with the PMSCs. There are practical leverage even in fragile contexts, even in conflicts like the Libyan one, that can be used, strengthening regulation, strengthening procurement, strengthening oversight, and that's something that from DCAF side we're doing in a variety of countries, and I'm very happy to be part of that of today's discussion on Libya.
Thank you very much, Jean-Michel, and thanks for reminding us that some of the norms that you've spoken about come out of complex contexts, and can be applied, I think, here as well. And thanks also for highlighting some of these entry points. I would say not all of which we would ordinarily think about, such as the idea of other states, a home state, a contracting state, having legal obligations in these contexts, and also thinking about the role that companies themselves, as well as states, have in making sound decisions around the selection of private military and security companies. So, resources obviously, again, are quite important, but perhaps in a different way. So thanks for shedding light on that as well. I'd next like to introduce our next speaker. Mr. Ehab Abdulgader has been Director and Chief Operating Officer of Petrogas since January of 2016, where he's been responsible for measuring effectiveness and efficiency of business processes, both internally and externally, developing and implementing growth strategies to improve the success of Petrogas and its partners, and also identifying, of course, and raising capital to foster the growth of the business through strategic investments, and providing consultancy to a number of major international companies operating in Libya across various sectors. He's also served in other positions at Petrogas previously, including business coordinator and general manager. And we're very eager to have your perspective today on several questions in particular, one of which is a very practical question. How does the extractive sector factor the security of oil fields into its daily work? We'd also be interested, given some of the challenges we've heard about with security of oil facilities today, we'd be interested in getting your thoughts on what type of security architecture could really facilitate more sustainable production of oil in Libya. And finally, reflecting on what Jean-Michel has just described in terms of some of these good practices and guiding principles, things like the voluntary principles on security and human rights, or the International Code of Conduct. In your opinion, how can some of these good practices be implemented practically at the company level? And are there any conversations in the private sector in Libya right now that are already exploring these issues? So thank you, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Abigail, and thanks to DCAF, obviously, for this invitation and opportunity to talk about, obviously, the security and subject and the oil sector. Obviously, being someone that operates within this sector, hopefully give a more practical, on-the-ground perspective on how things are currently are, and also what impact, obviously, the sector has on our operations. So in respect to oil and gas, you have to look at it as a sector that's actually quite conscious in regards to safety. So looking at it from an HSE perspective. So as the NOC has got a lot of international partners as well, each of its subsidiaries, or we'd call operating companies, develop their own actual procedures. So there might be a general procedure or perspective on how to engage in terms of applying security around its different facilities. Each one of those subsidiaries then will actually have its own rules and procedures. And then usually the security forces or the PFGs that are around those facilities actually have to then coordinate with the HSE divisions and then look into how to best implement a safe and secure environment, both for the services companies and the people that work inside, but also obviously for the people that are inside the facilities. During this time, obviously, it's been, should we say, a kind of like a roller coaster ride, unfortunately, because of the makeup of the PFG forces. Also take into consideration, there are many different events happening across, as you know, Libya is a very vast area that incorporates different communities, different groups, and now you've also got different international actors involved. So from a business point of view, usually before even a foot is set on the ground by, say, a foreign expat or engineer that's looking to come in, we have to sit down with our international partners and engage in a lot of due diligence about the best way to come in, where they have to stay, look at the logistics of their time that their period is here, how long are they exposed to the Libyan environment. Then after that, usually the companies have to approach, in terms of the private security companies, usually they have to approach a local-based company, whether that's achieved through their partners or it's achieved through companies that have established themselves. Normally in Libya, you need to be a Libyan entity, even if you have foreign people present in these companies. The registration has to go through, as far as I remember, through the Ministry of Interior to have the appropriate licenses to be able to actually engage and operate. So a lot of the larger international companies have actually created either local branches or teamed up with local people. And they offer a variety of different services in terms of how they can look after you. From that perspective, then you're talking about traveling different distances, getting the different permits and so on to be able to operate in these different regions. These cause a big challenge as well for us. In respect to the PFG as well, obviously, there isn't a great deal of contact, should we say, with the Libyan security other than when you come in the facilities. Generally speaking, they're usually outside the actual facilities. So there isn't a great deal of engagement from us. But over the years, as Libya has become a more fluid environment, you see a lot more security forces tending to mix in with the local, especially if they're like from the local communities. They sometimes are involved in like when the catering is offered to the oil personnel, then you've got people inside from the security that also come in and take what they need from their local supplies. There's also, as Tim's pointed out, in terms of local grievances, sometimes these are then politicized in terms of using the actual like security forces in those areas, which can sometimes put our employees at risk, which means you have to take into consideration also insurance matters and so on in terms of actually looking at viable and credible extraction capabilities as well. So from that aspect, we've seen a huge number of changes, and also trying to monitor how the NOC looks to actually manage the structure of the PFGs. It's originally a Ministry of Defense. It falls under the Ministry of Defense, and basically was based in Brega, which is in central Libya. But after 2011, there was a breakup between the central force, and you had one set that was based in Western Libya, which is based in Tripoli, and the other one is based in Benghazi. There's been fractures about the structure and leadership and how things are operate, but generally speaking, the PFGs are still, by and large, paid for by the Tripoli authorities. There's also another interesting aspect for people that are looking into it, is that the PFG originally was under the MOD, but then after a certain period during the Gaddafi era, they actually moved the payment and logistics and catering and finances and so on to actually under the NOC. So that was also an interesting development where the NOC back then looked at managing its own security autonomously, with approval obviously of the central government, to better manage the forces that were there and to create a more a leaner unit. So for us companies, that obviously makes a very difficult, not a very difficult, but a challenging situation to understand what's going on around you, obviously, as you're moving in and out of these facilities, what's going on, who do each of these personnel that we come across, who do they belong to? After 2011, that structure and that system was slowly changed, and the NOC decided that it no longer, because the number of forces that were actually present increased dramatically. So basically, it could no longer finance it under its existing budget, and asked the government and the MOD to take those forces back. So, by and large, it's because of the volatile situation and how the country's changed, the landscape has changed over a number of years. There's been, should we say, a very unclear understanding on what's happening. So the best way that us service companies, and obviously the IOCs and the subsidiaries of the NOCs have tried to do, is to manage these situations by and large on an individual basis rather than on a national approach. Until obviously very recently the 5+5 military agreement, where they're trying to look at unification of all the different security groups and military institutions. So what that means for us at the moment is obviously looking at how to calibrate and look at how we function as a service within that, and we adopt and change basically how we operate with obviously our international partners and local workforce as well, into how to basically best maneuver and ensure the safety of the staff. So if we believe the facility is not got the right HSE procedures in place, or there's a high risk that they'll encounter difficulties through armed groups that are present in those facilities, then we sit down and we have a frank discussion with these companies on how to mitigate those issues. So hopefully from a practical perspective, I know I've covered quite a few and wide range of topics. I'm trying to just give a real idea of what we're having to deal with here in Tripoli and in different parts of the cities, obviously, because some of the facilities are in the capital and all over Libya. So hopefully I've given a more holistic and practical approach to how we see the current situation in regards to the PFG. Thank you.
Thank you very much, for sharing your very practical, as you said, on the ground perspective. It's important for us to hear, and for highlighting, I think, the burden that's placed on oil companies, to manage the security of your personnel and anybody associated with the company in what is indeed a very fluid environment. So thanks again. Now I would like to introduce our last speaker for today, Mary Fitzgerald, who is a writer, researcher, and consultant specializing in the Euro-Mediterranean region with a particular focus on Libya. She's worked on Libya since 2011, conducted research for the International Crisis Group, the European Council on Foreign Relations, and a number of other institutions. More recently, she's also explored dynamics within communities in the oil-rich Fezzan region of southern Libya for a forthcoming paper for the United States Institute of Peace. She's also consulted for a number of international organizations working in Libya in areas including conflict mediation, civil society, and youth empowerment. Mary is an associate fellow at ICSR, King's College London, and a trustee of Friends of Europe. And Mary, we know that you've done some very interesting research recently. And so one of the questions we'd like to ask is related to that. Based on the work you've done around communities, how communities living around energy infrastructure in Fezzan really perceive issues, including security, how do you think we can broaden the conversation beyond this immediate question of private military and security companies to looking at more, longer term aspects regarding energy security? And then related to that, more specifically, what do you think is the impact of the PFG restructuring, and what do you think the PFG's unification might actually entail? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Abigail, and thank you to DCAF for organizing what many have observed already is a very timely discussion today on this topic. As you mentioned, Abigail, I have been researching most recently dynamics within communities in Fezzan. Fezzan being the oil-rich region in southern Libya, southwest Libya, where some of Libya's most vital energy infrastructure and oil fields are located. And I think we cannot talk about security in Libya's energy infrastructure without talking about what's happening amongst the communities, within the communities that live in and around that hydrocarbon infrastructure. It's critical. There's an intimate link there between security and what's happening locally. And if we look actually at the security challenges when it comes to Libya's energy sector since 2011, We've seen Islamic State and other criminal elements have carried out hit and run attacks on oil fields and other energy infrastructure. But actually the most serious challenge in terms of the impact of slashing dramatically oil production has come from acts of sabotage, hijacking, blockades and shutdowns driven by local grievances, and very often involving members of the petroleum facilities guards themselves. So I think that's a really important point to bear here, because it ties in the intimacy, if you like, of the links between local communities and the security challenge. When it comes to Fezzan, I think one particular episode is instructive here, and that is what we saw happen in late 2008, when a movement predominantly composed of young people from across Fezzan, calling itself the Fezzan Anger Movement, started sit-ins just outside Sharara, Sharara being Libya's largest oil field. It's located close to the town of Ubari in Fezzan. And these demonstrations, these shutdowns, first of all, managed to gather support from across Fezzan, transcending ethnic and tribal divides, which is quite unusual when it comes to Fezzan. And again, it was striking that this was organized, led, and predominantly driven by young people, which again was something quite unusual. The protests that they organized essentially hinged on a number of demands of the central government in Tripoli. These demands related to the poor living conditions in Fezzan. I think it's important to note that Fezzan is Libya's most oil-rich region, yet it remains its poorest region. So there's a big disconnect there in terms of where key oil fields are located and what local communities get from that. So demands related to living conditions, but also demands related to who works at the oil fields. A long-standing grievance that locals are not being hired in sufficient numbers at these key oil facilities. So essentially those protests carried on for some time and ultimately led to the shutdown rather of Sharara by the guards tasked with guarding Sharara. So it was a really interesting reminder for both the NOC, but also the Government of National Accord in Tripoli, that the South is bubbling with a whole range of grievances, but there are dynamics in the South that can basically erupt in terms of protests and possible shutdowns. Similarly, and Tim mentioned Ibrahim Jadran earlier, the Jadran episode in 2013, where Jadran, a key commander of the Petroleum Facilities Guard in Eastern Libya, essentially shut down for almost a year key oil ports in Eastern Libya. Again, drawing on local sentiment, grievances about how communities around the Eastern oil ports simply were not benefiting from the oil wealth. So all of that, I think, points to how interconnected these issues are and how we cannot talk about security without talking about those deeper issues in those communities. And then that again leads us to an even deeper discussion, which is about the whole area of CSR or corporate social responsibility in Libya. CSR is part of petroleum legislation in Libya. There are many Libyans and indeed international development specialists who would argue that the CSR framework when it comes to the energy sector in Libya needs to be reformed. It needs to be looked at, examined, and see how it can be better made, better fit for purpose, let's just say. So this is a much deeper conversation than just talking about the security right now of the oil fields. It ties in with so many issues and challenges for Libya's transition more generally. When it comes to the issue of PFG reform, restructuring, many would argue, it's been interesting to see and to trace this conversation over the last 6 years. Mustafa Sanala, the the current chairman of the NOC. It's been something of an obsession for Mr. Sanalla since he became chairman of the NOC in May 2014. He, of course, had observed what had happened with the Jadran blockade in eastern Libya the previous year. And that really gave him a sense that the PFG as a force, which, as Ehab mentioned, post-2011 essentially disintegrated into a constellation of armed groups across Libya. Different elements were recruited in that weren't previously part of a more professionalized force. Right now, the PFG, like many other entities in Libya, is very bloated. Officially, it has 23,000 personnel on the payroll, which is quite extraordinary. I mean, there are many who say that a significant proportion of those are essentially ghost personnel. But it gives you an idea of the challenges here. And I think in terms of the reform versus restructuring issue, there are many who would argue that essentially with the PFG, you have to start all over again with a whole new force. I think there are lessons to be drawn from, and indeed cautionary tales to be observed from what happened in Iraq, for example, when Iraq stood up its oil police in federal Iraq and the oil protection force in Iraqi Kurdistan. But this question, I think, of PFG reform hinges on several sub-questions, if you like. As this discussion moves forward, it's been interesting to see how it has gained significant momentum in recent weeks, managed to get it on the agenda of the agreement, the ceasefire agreement signed in Geneva, and Mustafa Sanalla is really going with that momentum now, trying to move this issue forward. But I think there are a number of questions to keep in mind here in terms of what a future PFG would look like. Ehab mentioned the fact that it has been under the Defense Ministry. There is a sense that the NOC would like to have the PFG under its control. That begs the question of whether the NOC has the capacity to oversee such a force. Mustafa Sanalla has talked about a PFG that would incorporate both civilian and military elements. Unclear as to how that would actually combine, if you like. But I think a key question here, and it goes back to that issue of local dynamics, is to what extent the PFG should be drawn from, PFG members should be drawn from the local communities. There are arguments, I know in Iraqi Kurdistan, for example, the Oil Protection Force draws on some members from local communities, a mix of some members from local communities and others from outside to keep that kind of balance. You could ask the question in Libya, is having a PFG that is predominantly drawn from the local community, is that a help or a hindrance, or more of a hindrance than a help? In terms of that, does that ensure the buy-in of local communities around the energy infrastructure and ensure a smooth running of operations, or does it actually do the reverse and raise the prospect of more disruptions or the use of tactics like blockades and shutdowns, etc.? I think also when it comes to the question of the PFG's future, you know, one interesting aspect of this that I know the NOC has been looking into is how to utilize technology when it comes to security of Libya's hydrocarbon sector. Would the use of technology actually change many of the conversations we've been having on reform of the PFG? What are the possibilities there in terms of drone technology? But then you could also ask a question in terms of, if we have a situation in Libya where the key security challenges for the energy sector are, as I mentioned, not so much attacks by terrorist groups and other criminal elements, but more challenges related to grievances in local communities, then would drone technology, for example, really do a whole lot to address that? So I think to sum up, I think that we have to remember that this is a conversation that really drills down into deeper dynamics in Libya in terms of institutional frameworks, the relationship between the central government and the regions, which is fraught in all kinds of ways, but particularly with southern Libya. But also to add that I think we should also remember, and maybe those of us, those of you joining us today who are not so familiar with the Libyan context, I think it's important to remember that when we talk about PMCs, the presence of PMCs in Libya right now is very limited. And many Libyans would say they would prefer it stays that way. They don't want a situation like we saw happen in Iraq or in other countries, Ecuador as an example, where PMCs rushed in and there was a very, very negative dynamic in all kinds of ways. I think generally there's a consensus in Libya and also amongst IOCs operating in Libya that what they would like preferably is the standing up of a proper petroleum facilities guard, sometime in the future, a professional force, a force that will not engage in some of the acts of sabotage we've seen the current PFG engage in, a force that can be trusted by both the NOC and its IOC partners. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mary. Really appreciate, a number of the points you've raised, not least, this question of really what Libyans want in terms of security and what they would find helpful in terms of structuring of the PFG in the future. And I would say some of the questions you've raised on the PFG are I think, more broadly applicable to the security sector as a whole. The question of where members of the forces are drawn from, the use of technology and how that affects security. And of course, you've also touched on points that have been raised by others as well, on the distribution of resources and just how crucial that is in shaping some of these other dynamics. And also ultimately, as you said, the role of communities, and their voice and whether or not that's heard at a certain point is also really influential. So thank you. I see we have several questions that have come in from the audience, but before we get to those, given the expertise on the panel and the interesting discussion we've had so far, I'd actually like to open it up to panel members first to see whether any of you would like to pose questions to other members of the panel. Mary, I'll actually start with you if you don't mind. Is there anything you'd like to ask of other panel members before we move on?
A question, I guess, to Jean-Michel, in terms of, Jean-Michel, you are familiar with the Libyan context, and you have been working on several of these issues when it comes to other contexts. What would you see as the kind of lessons Libya should learn from those other contexts, the cautionary tales I mentioned earlier?
Should I answer right away, Abby, then?
Please go ahead.
I think, and I think thank you for the question. I think, one thing that definitely comes to mind is the fact that in a lot of settings, when it comes to the regulation of PMSCs, we've seen, regulation has happened in reaction to developments in the field of PMSCs. And I think that was the case, in Iraq and Afghanistan and other settings as well. And, I thought your point on, as you said about the preference of stakeholders, I think was important, because the fact that people would like things to be that way doesn't mean it's not going to happen exactly that way. And what I mean by that is, it'd be good to put things in place now to actually have a sector that is well regulated and would actually make a meaningful contribution to wider security, to wider security governance overall, to wider, have a positive impact on security. So really, I'd say, this, the possibility, and I think, it's, if I can say this, Abby, for me, it's interesting to be on the panel, because, I remember discussions over the last, I haven't been in the Libya discussions from some time, but, there is a slight change, when it comes to, there seems to be a bit more structure coming when it comes to, the security around extractive sites. I mean, there's a number of processes in place. We don't know, how they will play out, but there's more, firm things in place than I would say probably for a number of for some time. And so, I think now is a particularly good moment to say, in that context, what are elements that can be done to, to strengthen the regulation of PMSCs, precisely to avoid any, to make sure, and I think that, that just to add, Mary, the international norms do not say that that states need to allow all kinds of PMSCs. I think the point that they say is, states should adequately regulate them, and states should particularly think about what kind of services they want to allow on their national territory. And so, and in the current situation where there's a discussion about, what types of security should be provided, in that case, to the facilities, I think it's a good moment to reflect, on the services that should be allowed, and then how to adequately regulate them, to be proactive on things.
Thanks, Jean-Michel. And did you have any follow-up questions for other members of the panel before we move on?
Maybe from my side, I think, we've, the other panelists have, I think, has very extensively addressed the PFG, and indeed it seems like, with the linchpin of the discussion. But if anybody would have to, would have elements to add, on the trends they see, for the foreseeable future, with the, say the use of PMSEs around extractive sites, be it by the public institution, if you can use that word, the NOC or other actors, I'd just be interested from a divisional interest perspective.
Thanks. Ehab, maybe I could pass that question to you, since you are on the ground, and perhaps closest to some of this. What trends do you see related to the use right now, or the increasing use maybe of private military and security companies around oil facilities?
In terms of the PMCs, like I said, from what I've seen, at least, in terms of the IOCs and the NOCs as well, is, like I said, there's the buildup of the physical factor in terms of the presence. Before, PMCs used to try to have more of a silent footprint. But as the wars increased, you see a lot more personnel, you see a lot more vehicles being used. It's sort of like a great shout, oh, we're actually here. But so that kind of footprint's definitely a trend we've seen in the oil sector, and also for diplomatic corps there, obviously, that creates vision. And it's also something that the state is looking at, more broadly speaking, in terms of, as it tries to provide this image that Libya can be a more secure kind of state. So it creates a space for PMCs to actually try and promote the idea that we can work with IOCs or in the energy facilities where we can harness technology or harness personnel and try to use it. So I've seen it in some of certainly some of the IOCs and the NOCs that have the budget to facilitate those kinds of things. So, and not just from the expats, also from the Libyans, they've been watching very carefully the space, how to, shall we say, create the image of a security enterprise, and then how to market that towards whether it's the state-owned companies or the IOCs through credible partners.
Thank you. And while you have the floor, are there any other questions you'd like to pose to other members of the panel?
Oof, such an established bunch of obviously guests. So I'd probably send my question towards Mary in terms of the local communities. Obviously, that's an important aspect actually for like the NOC and the IOCs. And how do you sit down and how do you create a real kind of like engagement in terms of speaking to them and then finding different ways and what they accept, obviously, as a local security presence, what's okay, what's not okay. Has there been any discussions with like the local NGOs or the people that you're engaged with in that kind of space? And in terms of Tim as well, considering that he's also had quite a few meetings with Sanallah, it would be interesting to hear his perspective in terms of how the NOC, or if it ever came across, in terms of how it actually finance having its own kind of like security structure, and what kind of guidelines or law is that kind of conversation taking place when you've had the opportunity to speak to some of them?
Mary, maybe I can pass the floor to you first and then to Tim after that.
It's an interesting question, and I think it's tied in terms of what I mentioned earlier about, you know, when the PFG is restructured, to what extent you will hire locally for the local PFG, or to what extent you will try to diversify. So having a PFG at Sharara, for example, that come from northwest Libya or northeast Libya, whether that would actually be an advantage or a disadvantage in many respects. But to go back to the example of the Fezzan anger movement again in Fezzan in Sharara in late 2018, what was again interesting about that episode is, as I mentioned earlier, it was predominantly youth-led and youth-driven. And that presented a challenge, I think, in terms of the NOC's engagement with that movement, given the realities in Fezzan in particular, where hierarchies, be they tribal hierarchies or generational hierarchies, are more enforced or more entrenched, I should say, than other parts of Libya. So it made it more difficult in terms of engagement, because there were all these sensitivities in terms of the hierarchy of the people you were dealing with. So if a channel was opened with the youth who were leading the Fezzan anger movement, would this not be taken seriously by other local stakeholders? Was the NOC, in fact, not really taking the Fezzan anger movement initially very seriously, because it was predominantly youth-led and youth-driven? So I think it's an interesting question in terms of how you engage with those communities, what avenues you explore, what channels you explore. And some of those avenues may be very obvious and clear based on what we know about local and national power dynamics in Libya. And very often they may not be so obvious or so clear. So it needs more kind of drilling into what the actual current dynamics in those communities actually are. And I think really the Fezzan anger movement was an interesting episode in terms of it challenged a lot of perceptions about Fezzan, about young people in Fezzan, and about how they fit into the dynamics and what they can actually do, what they can actually achieve, or more pertinently, how they can actually disrupt in order to have their grievances heard locally and in Tripoli.
Thanks, Mary. And I just comment before I hand it over to Tim to answer the other question Ehab has posed. Just note that this question has come up in a couple of our other discussions this week of the role of youth, you know, and the role youth are or are not playing in shaping decisions and shaping the dialogue around both security and governance, and what that's going to look like in the future at, you know, what really is a critical time of transition. So thanks for adding that. Tim, over to you to respond to Ehab's other question. And then I'd also ask if you have questions for other panel members as well.
Thanks. So with respect to what a reformed PFG would look like, I've heard different ideas. The most common was an entirely new force, actually, of private contractors, presumably of Libyan, but drawing also upon international experience. That was something that's been pitched, or I've heard pitched on many occasions. And I think one of the reasons for that being sparked is that there was a sense that you know, the structure had deteriorated and evolved to such an extent that it was almost beyond reform in that sense. And I'm certainly no expert on this structure, but I do note, if you look at the evolution of some of the control of oil and gas infrastructure, you can see that, for example, Haftar's Libyan Arab Armed Forces has created its own subunits, which seem to be kind of related to the PFG, but not. And so that, Abigail, that element of hybridity that you were mentioning before comes in here, because of course the PFG being formally affiliated to the MOD, there being two MODs and, you know, a series of different elements of integration, etc., which DCAF through Ahmad's great report in the last couple of weeks has kind of illustrated the complexity of that such a challenge for an institution that's focused on just continuing the sector to run. I think the question's been, as I indicated in my opening remarks, perhaps, whose responsibility is it to fix that? And I think that the NOC's response has largely been the government, because I think a lot of the grievances that they're faced with do relate to broader structural challenges. To what extent can the NOC, fill in the gaps for government service provision? How can the NOC continue to employ all of these young graduates of its technical colleges? Where do they go? And how does it resolve these issues of getting local communities engaged in higher level roles within the oil and gas sector, rather than being in many cases limited to security? And I think in that sense, it's kind of dipped its toes in before, as I understand it, in talking to IOCs in the state on the stabilization fund, etc. But for me, where they've ended up with this current gambit to push that political discussion forward seems to be quite telling, because it seems to be an acceptance that these things are connected. There are limits to what they can do, and the sheer numbers of blockades and the use of the oil sector has got to a point where that conversation can't be staved off any longer.
Great, thank you. Any other questions you'd like to raise for others before we move to questions from the audience?
Happy to let the audience chime in.
And we do have a number of audience questions. So let's move to that. We'll take as many of these as we can in the time which remains. And then I'd like to make sure we leave a few minutes at the end for our panel members to offer any concluding thoughts they might have. So I think the first question, Tim, might actually be for you. And that is, has the dispute between Sanala and El Khabar opened the door to a reunion of the two central banks?
Start off with an easy one, huh? Okay, so I think that there are differing perspectives on this. For many, they would just simply argue you can't reunify a central bank as long as you have two governments and two treasuries issuing payment orders. Others would contend that you could kind of bridge this gap in some kind of interim agreement to put a cap on, for example, Eastern spending, and find a kind of modus vivendi for an interim period. I think that we might see those attempts come to the fore again now, particularly given the international statement yesterday, which put a lot of support behind those kinds of ideas in my reading. And in the past, Kabir has been strong in pushing back against a board meeting. Obviously, a board meeting would have the potential to unseat him. And also, what he's been trading off in some senses is the contention that if there were a board meeting, the price for the beta elements would be the acceptance of the debt which has been created in spending in the east of the country, a significant portion of which has gone to Haftar's Libyan Arab armed forces. So we're kind of at a crunch point now. In a sense, I think Sanala's kind of done to Kabir what Kabir's done to Siraj, and we've kind of got those kinds of those deals going on. So the discussion yesterday, acceptance of a freeze in some sense, coming to the table for a discussion and specific mention of a board meeting, may indicate that the pressure is mounted to the extent that it could take place. I think then the question would be about pre-agreeing the agenda for that meeting in advance, because I think if it were the case that the position of the governor could be put up for grabs at that meeting, it probably would be unlikely to take place. And similarly, if a deal was expected over debt, that might be difficult to take place. But if the aspirations were a bit more moderate in terms of exchange rate or fixing elements of the banking system and freezing some of those problems, I think that that could be a reasonable goal at this stage.
Thank you. So we have another question here, and I think I'll direct this one to Ehab. This is a question on private security providers, you know, and human rights, due diligence, the codes of conduct that were mentioned earlier. How reliable do you think something like international certification of private security providers is in a context like Libya, you know, given the fact that these services are often subcontracted to local companies?
At the moment, if I'm honest, from our discussions that we have, like I said, with our international, usually the conversations in relation to obviously the due diligence of the processes, the procedures, the way you look after or treat human life as an asset in terms of when they are on the ground in Libya, whether it's Libyan facility workers or international facility workers. There isn't a great deal of international law that takes precedence. It's usually more looking at the local laws and what the implications are to those people and what corrective measures or what procedures do we take in case of scenario A, B, or C. So there hasn't been, as far as I'm aware, in terms of that aspect, but usually a lot of the HSE procedures or policies that are in place take into account, obviously, the safety and security. The PMCs, generally speaking, that I've come across talk about a plan, a procedure, but obviously not highlighting though, oh, we need to, in line with Geneva Convention, make sure that 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I haven't seen that in the Libya space per se, but definitely that there's a very conscious matter of in terms of respecting the local laws. In terms of also applying the application of accountability, that's also an important factor that I think needs to be considered. I saw it in one of the questions, I thought I just added in. More recently, there was obviously an attempt to breach the NOC headquarters. So in terms of accountability, the NOC has tried to, for any cases where there have been problems with PMCs or with the Petroleum Force Guard, is to actually pass these cases on to the, I'm going to forget the name now, basically to the authorities to basically report them for any breaches of local laws. But at the moment, international convention or international breaches of law doesn't come up too much in the conversation, but it should definitely. So hopefully that can be something that be talked about in the future.
Thank you. Jean-Michel, do you have anything to add on this question?
Yeah, maybe I would say, I think, you know, particularly in a context like Libya, I mean, internet certification, whether it's international or national, actually, you know, it always happens at, you know, you could say at a given moment T, but then to really make it work and, you know, for it to have an impact, I think it needs to be picked up and deliver also, I think, I'd say, an economic advantage to the companies that, you know, have gone all the way to get certified. And you know, I was talking with the International Code of Conduct, but this one has actually been, you know, broken down into an industry standard, an ISO standard, and companies that become a member of the International Code of Conduct Association, you know, have to implement industry standards in the operations. So there's, you know, it's an investment that these companies make. But I think, you know, to some extent, I mean, to a wide extent, then it also depends on the client's requirements, what the clients then ask of this security providers that they use. You know, a number of states are now requesting, for example, are now requesting ICOCA membership for companies to provide security for diplomatic sites. Some oil and gas companies don't do it well around the globe. So, you know, I think, you know, the point that Ehab was making, I think, is very important. You know, I think there's probably also a work to be done with clients to sensitize clients to the need to, you know, to use companies that provide responsible security.
Great. Thank you.
If obviously this is then legal within the legal framework, I mean, you can't, the company couldn't hire beyond that. But if the services are permitted, following the reflection that I was sharing with Mary on the Montreux document, then the client should also make sure to request the highest quality of service.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So I have another question, and I will start by directing this one to Mary, but I think others will probably have thoughts on this as well. And Mary, you've touched on this a bit already, but the question is, are there other examples of successful or attempted initiatives that really help to develop accountability, participation, and links between oil infrastructure, security personnel, and local communities?
In Libya, very few actually up to this point. In terms of what we've seen since 2011 is very much kind of rushed ad hoc measures taken to address blockades when they happen. So back in 2014, Jadran's blockade was ended by basically paying him and his men off and making all kinds of promises regarding development in Eastern Libya, many of which did not materialize. Similarly with the Fizan anger movement, Faiz Sarraj, the head of the GNA, visited Fizan, met with some of the members of the Fizan anger movement, made all the right promises and noises, etc., in terms of a development agenda for Fizan. But little of that is actually materialized. Funds were promised, some funds were given, a lot of questions over what kind of impact that had on the ground. So up to now, we've seen a lot of promises and a lot of very piecemeal measures taken that simply haven't been enough to address the deep-seated grievances. And I think that this is something that that the NOC is very aware of, in that the Fizan anger movement has largely petered away at this point, but the grievances that led to its formation and that groundswell of support it managed to gather within a very short period of time in Fizan, those grievances are still very much there. But I think another point here is, and it's something that Mustafa Sanalla has mentioned to me a number of times over the years, is how post-2011, Libya went from this sense that Libya's oil wealth was a national resource to be enjoyed by every Libyan, to a sense that essentially the communities that literally live on the oil have a greater right to that oil and a greater say. And they see it as their weapon, if you like, to make their voice heard, their leverage to make their voice heard in Tripoli. And I often think about the campaign that I'm sure several of you will recall from Libya in 2012. The NOC ran a billboard campaign throughout the country, and the slogan on the billboard translated roughly as "Oil is our weapon for development." Now, the choice of the word weapon, in hindsight, a little unfortunate, but it was an attempt by the NOC to create that sense of national buy-in and national attachment to the idea of oil wealth as a resource for all Libyans, and not simply a resource that those living on top of the oil, that it's theirs more than it belongs to the entire country. And I think the question that Sanalla has often pondered is, how do you reverse that trend? How do you get back to this idea that the oil wealth is a national resource that every Libyan has an equal entitlement to?
Thanks very much. And so again, we come back to this question of control and distribution of resources to some extent. I'd like to ask Jean-Michel whether there's anything you would like to add, because I know that you've been involved in work, not in Libya, but in other settings, around multi-stakeholder initiatives that can develop accountability and links between oil companies or extractive companies in other settings, security personnel and local communities. So I wonder if you can offer any good examples, maybe from other contexts that might be interesting to, as part of the response to this question.
Yes, no, and thank you to that. And I started, I think, mostly talking about what we do on PMSCs, but we've done a good amount of work on wider security on extractives, and I think we've worked in a number of countries with the specific units actually assigned to extractive, the public units assigned to extractive sites. So I think it's something that we've done, and I think so. On these units, I think the other panelists were already saying, I think already said an important amount of things. I think one is really, what is the mix within these units, and how do you avoid these units also then becoming rent seekers themselves, but like contributing to good governance overall the security sector. And there, the question maybe is not. I think there's a wider question in terms of economic development opportunities with relation to local communities. I don't know if specifically that means giving people a job in the security unit, but there's definitely it is there is a question of economic development, because I think what Mary said about Fezzan is interesting, because I think a lot of the contexts we've worked in are oil rich, but are among the poorest regions in their respective countries, so this resource curse, so to speak, is widespread. And then indeed, there's an attraction to use the sites as a leverage. And I think that'd be the second point. There is, if there's not a wider political resolution to this, then the security aspect can only go so far. I'm just, right now one of the countries we're involved with is Peru, and there's been a lot of protests around mining sites for a variety of reasons, which are in there more tied to COVID. But clearly the police in that case is trying to manage the public order, but it's part of a wider public discussion. So I think that I would say you can't look at the issue of energy security in that sense as dislinked from the wider discussion on how these natural wealths are being shared across society. The voluntary principles, have spawned a number of national working groups, and I think DCAF has been involved with some of them, and most of the working groups right now are in at the national level. So you would have people from the extractive sector, people from international governments, people from the private sector, and people from civil society sitting together in the capital. But actually, I think one example that just comes to mind that I'd like to share is we're actually supporting a working group right now precisely in Peru, in the biggest mining region in Peru, because getting down to the technical level of really having this discussion on concrete security needs between the people, the communities surrounding the extractive sites, the extractive companies themselves, and the security actors. And what, again, Mary, what you were saying, reminded me of that, because there are a lot of socioeconomic grievances around the site that then translate into incidents, plus sometimes heavy-handed handling of security by the company and the security providers. And there, for us, really, having people come together at the local level to talk about practical aspects, of security, has been something that that's worked, and that I think could potentially also work in the current context, because I think the other panelists made a clear point that while wide security governance at the national level might be something that's too that needs to be worked on, but it's still a bit abstract. The local level is there, the local actors are there. I think the DCAF study that was launched on Monday also talks about hybrid security, talks about these local actors. And so I think seeing how you can bring people together more at the multi-stakeholder dynamic at the local level could actually be applied even in a context like that, like Libya. And even sometimes it seems that things things might seem a bit too bleak, but I think there's experiences from other settings in equally fragile, even more fragile contexts, that when you work together on these very practical security elements, and again tying in public and private security, I think there's ways to work forward there.
Great, thank you. So the next question I think goes to Mary, and that is, how would the use of drone technology, which you mentioned earlier, affect the relationship with and dependence on local communities?
Thank you, Abigail. This is actually a really good question, because we've seen in other contexts where drone technology has been employed for surveillance, etc. It's actually caused some resentment amongst the existing, this is in context other than Libya, existing oil protection forces, essentially, who feel that they are being pushed out of the way because simply there's better technology that can do the work of what was done by personnel before. I think though, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the use of drone technology when it comes to the Libyan context, drone technology of course can be good in terms of picking up or detecting possible threats from militant groups, criminal elements, etc. But as I mentioned earlier, if we're talking about one of the main challenges to the smooth running of Libya's oil facilities and infrastructure, we're actually talking about challenges that come from within communities as opposed to external threats, so to speak. So it's a different dynamic. But I wanted to also add something following on from what Jean-Michel said. You know, again, and lessons learned from other contexts, and to go back to the Iraqi Kurdistan setup, where you have, as I understand, the oil protection force is essentially run by the Interior Ministry and the Energy Ministry. And you have IOCs that actually fund the oil protection, that is international oil corporate companies that fund the oil protection force in a way that's cost recoverable for the IOCs, which I think is quite interesting because in Libya hasn't had an energy and oil ministry for several years now. There are questions over whether it ever would have an oil ministry. Some Libyans would say Libya needs an oil ministry in terms of the NOC on its own, despite the excellent job it does, is not sufficient in terms of how the energy sector is going to develop in future. So I think there's an interesting kind of example to be taken there from Iraqi Kurdistan, but also other contexts where you see several different components of a government overseeing this issue and then bringing IOCs in a bigger way. I know a number of years ago when Islamic State was particularly active in targeting energy infrastructure in Libya, there was a conversation at one point with NOCs over whether they would be willing to get involved in terms of further security layer, let's just say, aimed at countering attacks by Islamic State. Again, I think the possible role of IOCs here in terms of the security infrastructure in the energy sector, but also, as I mentioned earlier, I think we also have to bring in the CSR component in this as well, and really think about how, you know, CSR in Libya pre-2011 meant something quite kind of unique because of the regime that was in place in Libya at that time. CSR post-2011 hasn't really been thought about a lot. And many Libyans and development specialists would argue that the framework on CSR in Libya really needs revisiting, needs reform, needs restructuring to make it fit for purpose.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and this one will go to Tim. Another easy one, I think. So Tim, given your past studies, you know, what do you think are the prospects that foreign actors will engage in existing rent-seeking activities, you know, whether this is oil smuggling or something else, or develop new ones, you know, given their continuing presence on the ground?
The external actors themselves. Well, I think that it's relatively unlikely that you would see major foreign actors seek to dominate those kinds of illicit sectors of the market. But that's not to say certainly that PMCs who deploy and may be paid by those foreign actors wouldn't also become embroiled in some of these elements. I mean, we've seen, for example, if you look at the fuel sector, that the Libyan Arab Armed Forces heralded entrance into the south actually didn't do that much to break up fuel smuggling networks, and in many cases just led to different individuals running them. And we saw with prices that they went up for a little while and came back down. So in that sense, I think it's always worth looking at specific geographies and understanding what sources of revenues are available and where the funding can be brought in from. So this is for local actors in particular in places like the South. these are key revenue streams. And so it's not easy to just go and turn them off. And so similarly, I don't anticipate that external actors would seek to do that. I think the game is a slightly different one with some of the external actors. You know, the debate about whether Russian contractors are engineers or have a security mandate, what exactly they might be doing around infrastructure. I think that is part of the broader political set of negotiations, lines in the sand. We've seen increasingly that external actors have played a leading role on that front and in deciding really which Libyan actors are able to move forward or not, you know, especially with the pushback of the Libyan Arab Armed Forces wouldn't have been possible, of course, without Turkish support. So discussions around any key area of the security space will have an interest to countries such as Turkey, those engaged on the ground, such as Egypt and Russia as well. So I think that's just unfortunately another set of agendas to kind of guard against, and really makes it more difficult, particularly when you're talking about specific areas and, you know, certain countries not wanting to move past Jufra, for example. So I think that this is just an added complication, really. And it's quite an unwelcome one. But I still think that actually one of the bigger questions, which we haven't always had great answers to, is what's the nature of the control in areas of oil and gas infrastructure? So, for example, to what extent can the LAF just tell a PFG in the Oil Crescent to do something? My experience of speaking to people and looking at this is that actually there's quite a bit of give and take and a kind of dynamic relationship between these actors, which is leveraged and can shift. So we saw, for example, that certain elements of one community aligned with Jedran would effectively the same groups would flip and then become aligned with the LAF, albeit with some different leaders and with a different intermediary. So the transactional nature of the oil and gas sector here, because of its importance and because of the leverage that it brings, is always something that's worth watching, which is why the 5+5 track is people have their eyes pinned on it. I think this idea that the oil sector could be taken out of that context and just treated as a technocratic job of securing a business is a bit unrealistic because of the significance that it has to the broader political conflict.
Thank you. So with that, I would like to move into wrapping up today's discussion. And I'd like to give all of our panel members an opportunity to just offer one or two quick concluding points. Jean-Michel, maybe I could start with you.
Thank you, Abby. And you know, for me, first of all, you know, I'd like to thank my co-panelists. It was hugely interesting. And for me, I think, you know, when we're discussing following the situation with our MENA colleagues, you know, we felt that, you know, the oil side, I mean, extractor side, but particularly the oil facilities, you know, are, you know, some part of, I mean, one of the key prisms in the country, you know, where a number of, you know, security sector governance challenges come together, combined with, you know, the wider socioeconomic dimensions and the current political process. And for me, the talk today, the discussion today, you know, I think underlines this, you know, this analysis. I think there, you know, be it with regards to the PFG, be it with regards to, you know, the potential use of PMCs in the future, but there's, you know, I think there's definitely elements there, you know, where this specific element of security provision around businesses, around extractive sites, but with a larger societal impact. You know, this is very relevant, and, you know, I think that, you know, you know, for me, it's, you know, the beginning of a wider discussion, but, you know, very interesting beginning of it.
Thank you. Mary, anything you'd like to offer in conclusion?
Well, I think to finish, kind of echoing my comments earlier, that I think we need to remember that the conversation on energy, the security rather of Libya's energy sector, has to be holistic. It cannot be seen as a conversation purely about security forces. It has to be a conversation that involves the dynamics of the communities living in and around those oil facilities, because unless you have buy-in from those communities, widespread buy-in, you're always going to run the risk of further acts of sabotage that we've seen since 2011, be they blockades, shutdowns, or other acts of sabotage. So I would stress the need for a holistic conversation that is bringing in many different elements as well from those communities, and not elements that may be considered the kind of usual channels, the usual suspects, if you like, in terms of interlocutors. But, you know, one of the things I've been drilling into in Fazan, taking my cue from the fact the Fazan anger movement was predominantly youth driven and led, is the role of youth, youth as a disruptive force in that respect, the specific grievances of youth as a constituency in Fazan that have been in many ways overlooked in terms of the conversation about development of that specific region. But also I would say that, you know, the question of the PFG, and going back to what Tim was mentioning in terms of the, you know, this question being on the agenda now in terms of the current part of the security track of the current process, there are some concerns that basically bringing in such a huge challenge as restructuring the PFG is, it's a multifaceted challenge, it's a complicated challenge, it will take a long time to stand up a professional PFG force. There are concerns that actually having it part of this process, which is essentially a political process, could produce something that is actually an imperfect product of its time, as opposed to something that can really last the course in terms of a proper energy protection force for Libya that will last well into the future. So I think there's some caution as well on that in terms of how you incorporate such an important issue for Libya's long-term future and prosperity into a political process that, you know, has flaws, is imperfect, is being pulled in many different directions, and how that will actually affect the finished product.
Thank you very much. Ehab, let me turn it over to you now for any concluding remarks you'd like to offer.
Thank you. I'm going to look at this actually like as a Libyan. So in respect to, we mentioned that in terms of the state, how it basically manages this problem that we have in terms of a lot of people being on state salary and so on, and the PFG is part of like a more national structure. And then looking at what, if PMCs can also play, what kind of role, what kind of technology can be used, what kind of innovation can be kind of brought in so that you can, you're not so reliant on the state to even look after all these facilities, considering that there's also an international private buy-in and not just a Libyan buy-in at the same time. So I would like to see definitely some kind of reform, some kind of accountability in terms of how the structure is made, what can be done, what can't be done, looking at the value of the assets. I know it's a very, you could say kind of generic thing, but I think you need to start to have a more general idea of what it is you're trying to protect and for who. And then from that build like an organizational kind of structure on how you would go about then and tackle that problem. Because we've got a lot of challenges, as you know. So you have to kind of try and break it down first and then slowly build back up again. So those are my concluding remarks.
Thank you. Tim, over to you. Any other concluding thoughts you'd like to offer?
I think I just echo some of Mary's sentiments there in the looking at this holistically. And I would just make one kind of note of caution. I do think that there is an opportunity now to start to address some of these elements in a political settlement. My view personally is that there needs to be a significant amount of content surrounding how oil and gas revenues should be managed in that political settlement, because I think that it's a core part of the conflict. But as of yet, the debate around those issues remains quite poorly explored. So you'll hear issues about distribution of revenues, but in many cases, you'll have seen like the demands some of the demands coming out of the oil blockade were just for a payout. And I think that that conversation among Libyans is happening through processes such as the ESQA discussions. But that's a real key discussion, and that hasn't really been bridged in any meaningful sense on the political level, which still remains quite stuck at who will fill which post and on the level of personalities. And so I think that is the bridge between the societal grievances, you know, what should the state provide, what should be done locally, to what extent should some powers be decentralized. And that hasn't really pushed through yet. And I think that that is something which needs to move further for this issue to really be, for us to really be talking about holistic solutions.
Great, thank you. You know, I really appreciate, I think, what everybody's brought today in terms of first, you know, just reminding us that we can't separate this discussion from broader questions of political, economic, and societal developments. You know, nice to hear some reflection on perhaps practical entry points, whether that's the legal framework or just, again, practical arrangements between communities or among communities, you know, oil companies, security providers, and the government, you know, and paying attention, of course, to the ways in which local demands, perhaps from interlocutors we're not always working with, can actually be a driver of change. And I think ultimately, you know, all of you have pointed out that we're not just talking about short-term solutions, but we really do need to be thinking about using this particular moment in time to think about longer-term approaches to not only providing security, but also ensuring appropriate accountability and oversight mechanisms are in place, whatever those look like in this context. So I really want to say a big thank you to all of our panel members. Many thanks to our audience as well. Thanks for joining us today. And I wish you all a good afternoon.